She stood there in her white dress, hands trembling as she held the bouquet her mother had spent weeks choosing. The organ music filled the church, 200 guests turned in their seats smiling, and her father squeezed her arm gently as they prepared to walk down the aisle. This was supposed to be the moment every little girl dreams about, the moment where everything finally makes sense, where love wins, where the fairy tale becomes real. But in less than 10 minutes, Emily Carter would discover that the man waiting for her at the altar, the man she'd loved for 3 years, the man who proposed to her on a beach in South Carolina while the sun set behind them, wasn't who he said he was. And what she would do next, in front of everyone she'd ever known, would be talked about for years to come. Because sometimes the person you trust most is the person hiding the darkest secret. And sometimes the truth doesn't wait for a convenient moment to destroy everything you believed in. It was a Saturday in June 2023, the kind of perfect summer day that makes you believe good things are possible. The church in Charleston was decorated with white roses and candles. Emily's bridesmaids wore soft lavender dresses. Her mother cried happy tears in the front row. The groom, a man we'll call Michael Stevens, stood at the altar in a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the successful businessman he claimed to be. He smiled at Emily as she walked toward him, and for a moment, everything seemed absolutely perfect. But perfection, as Emily was about to learn, can be the most dangerous illusion of all. Because while everyone was focused on the ceremony, on the flowers and the music, and the promise of forever, no one noticed the woman who slipped into the back row of the church. A woman with dark sunglasses and a black dress. A woman who'd driven 6 hours that morning with documents in her purse and a story that would shatter everything. Emily had met Michael 3 years earlier at a coffee shop in downtown Charleston. She was a nurse at the Medical University Hospital, 29 years old, still healing from a bad breakup. He was 34, charming, confident, and he made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in years. He told her he worked in real estate development, that he traveled frequently for projects, that he'd moved to Charleston from Atlanta to start fresh after his parents passed away in a car accident. Emily's heart broke for him when he told her that story, tears in his eyes as he described being an orphan with no family left. She held his hand across the coffee shop table and told him he wasn't alone anymore. That's how it started, with her compassion, with her beautiful, trusting heart, seeing a wounded man who needed love. And Michael, if that was even his real name, knew exactly what he was doing. Their relationship moved quickly, but not suspiciously so. He was attentive, but gave her space. He met her parents, charmed her friends, showed up at the hospital with flowers when she worked double shifts. He had explanations for everything. Why he didn't have many photos from his childhood, house fire destroyed everything. Why he never talked about old friends, moving around so much made it hard to stay in touch. Why his phone was always face down, force of habit from business meetings. Emily's best friend Sarah mentioned once that it was odd how little they knew about his past, but Emily defended him. She'd seen enough trauma in her nursing career to know that some people cope by moving forward instead of looking back. She thought she was being understanding. She thought she was being mature. She didn't realize she was being targeted. The proposal came on their 2nd anniversary. Michael took her to Folly Beach, her favorite place in the world, right before sunset. He'd set up a picnic, and when he got down on one knee, Emily couldn't breathe. The ring was beautiful, a vintage diamond that he said had belonged to his grandmother, one of the few things that survived the fire. Emily said yes through tears, and they spent the evening planning their future. He wanted a small wedding, just close friends and family. She wanted something bigger, a celebration with everyone they loved. They compromised on 200 guests at her family's church. Michael seemed nervous about the larger wedding, said he wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, but Emily assured him it would be perfect. She was so focused on making him comfortable, on being the understanding partner, that she never asked herself why a successful businessman in his mid-30s had absolutely no one from his past to invite, not a single person. The wedding planning took 8 months. Emily's mother helped with every detail while Michael claimed work was overwhelming and he trusted her judgment completely. He disappeared some weekends, always with explanations about property deals in other cities. Emily noticed he never invited her on these trips, said he'd be working the whole time and she deserved to relax. She noticed his phone habits too, how he'd step outside to take certain calls, how he never left it unattended. But these observations floated past her like clouds, nothing substantial enough to grab onto, nothing concrete enough to call a red flag. Because Michael balanced every absence with presence, every mysterious phone call was followed by a surprise date night. Every weekend away was followed by expensive gifts. He was methodical, he was careful, and he almost got away with it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emily was at his apartment, the place he'd moved into a year earlier. He was in the shower and his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She wasn't the type to check his phone, had never even considered it, but the message preview showed on the lock screen. It was from someone named Jennifer. The message said, "The kids are asking about you again. How much longer are we supposed to keep lying?" Emily's stomach dropped. She stared at the message until the screen went dark. When Michael came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, she was sitting on the couch holding his phone. The look on his face, just for a second before he controlled it, told her everything, but he recovered quickly. Too quickly. He explained that Jennifer was his real estate partner's ex-wife, that she was bitter about their divorce, and sometimes sent him inappropriate messages trying to cause problems. He showed her his conversation with his partner, messages that seemed to confirm the story. Emily wanted to believe him so badly that she did. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But that message planted a seed of doubt that grew quietly in the following 2 weeks. Emily started noticing things she'd ignored before, how Michael never wanted to take photos together and post them on social media, said he valued privacy, how he'd never given her the address of his office, said he mostly worked from client sites, how in 3 years she'd never met a single person from his life before Charleston, not one friend, not one colleague, not one person who could verify any story he'd ever told her. She tried to push these thoughts away, told herself she was being paranoid, that pre-wedding jitters were making her paranoid. But the morning of the wedding, while she was getting her makeup done, she made a decision. She asked her younger brother Tom, who worked in IT, to do something for her. She gave him Michael's full name, date of birth, and the city he claimed to be from. She asked him to just do a basic background check, nothing invasive, just to ease her mind. Tom hesitated but agreed, said he'd look into it while she was at the ceremony. Emily told herself it was silly, that she'd feel guilty about it later, that she was about to marry a good man. But she needed to know. She needed that seed of doubt removed before she said "I do." The ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. By 1:30, the church was filling up. Emily's bridesmaids were helping her with her dress. Her mother was crying and taking pictures, and everyone was telling her how beautiful she looked. Michael was in a separate room with his groomsmen, guys he'd met through work in Charleston, none of whom had known him longer than 2 years. The wedding coordinator came in at 1:45 to say everything was ready. Emily took a deep breath, looked at herself in the mirror, and tried to ignore the knot in her stomach. She told herself it was normal to be nervous. She told herself that in an hour she'd be married to the man she loved, and everything would be perfect. She had no idea that at that exact moment, a woman named Catherine Reynolds was parking her car outside the church, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror, and preparing to walk inside with information that would destroy everything. Catherine had spent 3 years looking for Michael. 3 years of hiring private investigators, tracking credit card transactions, following leads that went nowhere. She'd almost given up a dozen times, almost accepted that the man who'd ruined her life had disappeared forever. But then, 6 weeks earlier, one of her Google alerts had finally hit. A wedding announcement in the Charleston Post and Courier, Emily Carter and Michael Stevens to be married in June. The engagement photo showed a couple smiling on a beach, and Catherine had stared at that photo for an hour, her hands shaking because she recognized that man. His name wasn't Michael Stevens. His name was David Wheeler, and he wasn't single. He was her husband. They'd been married for 9 years. They had 2 children together, a boy and a girl, ages 7 and 5. And 14 months ago, David Wheeler had left for a business trip and never came home. He'd drained their joint bank account, maxed out credit cards in Catherine's name, and disappeared. Catherine had reported him missing. The police found evidence that he'd planned his disappearance, created a new identity, and started a new life somewhere else. But without more information, there was nothing they could do. Catherine had been left with 2 confused children, a mountain of debt, and no answers. She'd sold their house, moved in with her parents in North Carolina, and spent every spare moment trying to find him. Not because she wanted him back, because she wanted justice, because she wanted her children to understand what happened, because she wanted him to face consequences for what he'd done. And now, after 3 years, she'd found him. He was getting remarried, to a woman who had no idea who he really was. Catherine knew she could have gone to the police first, could have handled this through proper channels, but she'd learned that David was good at slipping away. If she reported him and he got wind of it, he'd disappear again, so she made a different choice. She decided to show up at his wedding, to expose him in front of everyone, to make sure he couldn't run this time. The ceremony began exactly at 2 o'clock. Emily walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her heart pounding, her hands cold despite the warm June afternoon. Michael watched her approach with tears in his eyes, and for a moment, Emily's doubts melted away. This was real. This was love. This was her future. The pastor welcomed everyone and began the ceremony with a prayer. Then he started the traditional words that have begun countless weddings. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Emily and Michael in holy matrimony. If anyone here knows of any reason why these 2 should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. It's a formality, a line that never actually stops a wedding, except when it does. Catherine stood up from the back row, her voice steady and clear as it cut through the church. I do. I have a reason. That man is already married. To me. The church erupted. 200 people turned in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. Emily's mother gasped. Her father stood up from the front row. The bridesmaids looked at each other in confusion, and Michael's face went completely white. Emily stood frozen at the altar, her brain unable to process what was happening. The pastor stammered, asking security to handle the situation, but Catherine was already walking down the aisle, a folder of documents in her hands. Her voice never wavered as she addressed the crowd. His name isn't Michael Stevens. It's David Wheeler. We've been married for 9 years. We have 2 children together. 14 months ago, he abandoned us, stole everything we had, and created a new identity. And he was about to do the same thing to this woman. Catherine reached the front of the church and handed the folder to Emily. Inside were marriage certificates, birth certificates for 2 children, photographs of David with Catherine and their kids, and a police report documenting his disappearance and fraud. Emily looked at the documents, then at Michael, then back at the documents. Her hands were shaking so violently that papers fell to the floor. Michael, or David, whoever he was, opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For 3 years, he'd had an answer for everything. For 3 years, he'd been in control. But now, in front of 200 witnesses, with evidence spread across the altar, he had nowhere to run. Emily's father climbed the steps to the altar, took the folder from his daughter's hands, and began reading through the documents. The church was completely silent, except for Emily's mother sobbing in the front row. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, Emily's father looked at Michael with an expression of pure rage. He didn't yell, he didn't make a scene. He simply said, "Get out of this church right now or I'm calling the police." Michael took 1 step back, then another, his eyes darting between Emily, Catherine, and the doors. Then he ran. He pushed past the groomsmen, past the shocked guests in the aisles, and out the church doors. Someone called after him, but he was already in his car, engine starting, tires squealing as he sped away from the church. Inside, Emily collapsed. Her knees buckled, and if her father hadn't caught her, she would have fallen. Her bridesmaids rushed to her side, trying to help her stand, but Emily couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The man she loved, the man she trusted, the man she was supposed to marry, was a complete stranger. Everything he'd told her was a lie. Every story, every explanation, every moment of their relationship was built on deception. And she'd believed all of it. She'd defended him. She'd loved him. Catherine approached slowly, her anger replaced by sympathy. She knelt beside Emily and spoke softly. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. But you needed to know before you married him." Emily looked up at this stranger who'd just saved her life, and through her tears she whispered, "Thank you." The church cleared slowly. Guests filed out in shocked silence, not knowing what to say or do. Emily's mother wanted to take her home immediately, but Emily refused to move. She sat on the steps of the altar in her wedding dress, staring at nothing, trying to understand how her entire life had just fallen apart. Catherine sat with her, and for an hour they talked. Catherine told her everything. How David had been a loving husband and father for years before something changed. How he'd become secretive, defensive, distant. How he'd told her he needed to travel more for work. How one day he just didn't come home. How she'd discovered the fraud, the stolen identity, the complete betrayal. And how she'd spent 3 years trying to find him, not for revenge, but because her children deserved to know what happened to their father. Emily listened to all of it, and with each detail she recognized patterns from her own relationship, the secrecy, the defensiveness, the mysterious trips, the isolation from his past. She'd seen all the signs and ignored them. Emily's brother Tom arrived at the church around 4 o'clock. He'd been at the reception venue setting up when he heard what happened, and he rushed over immediately. He found Emily still sitting at the altar, still in her dress, looking completely devastated. He sat down next to her and pulled out his laptop. He'd finished the background check she'd asked for that morning. What he found was worse than anyone imagined. The man they knew as Michael Stevens didn't exist before 3 years ago. The Social Security number he'd given Emily was stolen from a deceased person. The real estate company he claimed to work for didn't have him in their employee records. His apartment was leased under a fake LLC. His bank accounts were structured to avoid detection, and there were warrants for David Wheeler's arrest in 3 states: fraud, identity theft, forgery. He wasn't just a liar. He was a career criminal, and Emily had been his latest mark. The police were called, and by evening, a full investigation was underway. Officers took statements from Emily, Catherine, and everyone who'd known Michael over the past 3 years. They discovered that he'd used Emily's identity to open credit cards, take out loans, and create business accounts. He'd been planning to clean out her bank accounts right after the wedding and disappear again. The wedding itself was part of the con. By marrying her, he'd gain access to her family's money, her father's business connections, and her excellent credit. Then he'd vanish, leaving her with debt and legal problems while he started over somewhere else with a new name and a new victim. If Catherine hadn't found him, if she hadn't shown up at that church, Emily would have woken up a few months from now to discover her husband gone and her life destroyed. The realization of how close she came to complete ruin was almost worse than the heartbreak. Over the following weeks, the story spread. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national media. Groom exposed at wedding as wanted criminal. Woman saves stranger from marriage fraud. The videos that guests had recorded on their phones went viral. Emily's face became recognizable everywhere she went. Strangers approached her in grocery stores to ask if she was okay. Her hospital was flooded with media requests. She had to take leave from work because she couldn't focus, couldn't function, couldn't be the nurse her patients needed. She moved back in with her parents because she couldn't stand being alone. She couldn't sleep without nightmares of Michael's face. She couldn't look at her wedding dress hanging in the closet. Her mother eventually took it away, along with all the decorations, the gifts, the remnants of a life that never existed. Catherine stayed in Charleston for a few weeks to help with the investigation. She and Emily became unlikely friends, bonded by their shared experience of being deceived by the same man. Catherine's children, when they learned their father had been found, asked if he was coming home. Catherine had to explain, in terms her 7-year-old and 5-year-old could understand, that their father had made very bad choices and wouldn't be coming home. The little boy asked if it was his fault, if he'd done something wrong to make his daddy leave. Catherine held him tight and promised him that none of this was his fault, that sometimes adults make terrible decisions that hurt the people who love them, and that their father's choices had nothing to do with how wonderful they were. Emily was there when this conversation happened, and she saw herself in those children, the confusion, the misplaced guilt, the desperate need to understand why someone you loved could hurt you so deeply. 6 weeks after the wedding that never happened, the police found David Wheeler. He'd made it all the way to Oregon, had already started building a new identity, had already met a new woman at a coffee shop. The pattern was beginning again. He was arrested on multiple charges and extradited back to South Carolina to face trial. Emily was notified of his arrest, but she didn't feel the satisfaction she expected. She just felt empty. The man she loved never existed. David Wheeler was a stranger. She'd fallen in love with a character he'd created, a role he'd played, a mask he'd worn. And now she had to grieve not just the loss of a relationship, but the loss of something that was never real to begin with. Her therapist told her this was one of the hardest types of betrayal to process because there was no closure, no final conversation, no explanation that would make sense, just the reality that she'd been targeted, manipulated, and used. The trial took place 4 months later. Emily attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Catherine beside her. She listened as prosecutors laid out David's history. He'd been doing this for over a decade. Emily and Catherine weren't his first victims. They weren't even his second or third. There had been at least 6 other women across different states. Always the same pattern. Meet a successful, independent woman. Create a tragic backstory. Build trust slowly. Propose, use their resources, disappear. He'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, destroyed credit ratings, left emotional devastation in his wake. And he'd been caught before, had served time for fraud, had been released and immediately started over. The justice system had failed to stop him, and now his victim count was in the double digits. When it was Emily's turn to give her victim impact statement, she walked to the witness stand with her head held high. She looked directly at David Wheeler, who sat at the defense table avoiding eye contact, and she spoke clearly. "You stole 3 years of my life. You made me question my judgment, my intuition, my ability to trust myself. You took my dream of building a family and turned it into a nightmare. But you didn't break me. You tried to destroy me, but I'm still here, and every other woman you hurt, we're all still here. You thought we'd be too ashamed to speak up, too embarrassed to admit we'd been fooled. But we're not ashamed. You should be. You're the one who has to live with what you've done. You're the one who has to look in the mirror and see a coward who preys on good people. I hope you get the help you need. But more than that, I hope you never get the chance to hurt anyone else again." The judge sentenced David Wheeler to 12 years in prison on multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and forgery. It wasn't enough for what he'd done, but it was something. 2 years have passed since that day in the church. Emily still lives in Charleston, still works as a nurse, still struggles sometimes with trusting people. She goes to therapy every week. She's rebuilt her credit. She's reconnected with friends she'd neglected during her relationship with David. She's learned to recognize red flags she missed before, the isolation tactics, the love bombing, the manufactured urgency to move the relationship forward, the stories designed to elicit sympathy, the excuses that always made just enough sense. She's joined support groups for victims of fraud and romantic scams, and she's shared her story dozens of times to help other women avoid what happened to her. She's become an advocate for better background check resources and dating safety. She's turned her nightmare into purpose. Catherine's children are doing better too. The little boy stopped asking if he caused his father to leave. The little girl started smiling again. Catherine used the restitution money from David's sentencing to pay off some of the debt he'd left her with, and she's slowly rebuilding her life too. She and Emily talk every few weeks, checking in on each other, reminding each other that they survived, that they're stronger than they thought, that what happened to them doesn't define them. Emily recently started dating again, cautiously, taking things slow. She's learned to listen to her instincts, to ask questions, to verify information, to not mistake secrecy for mystery. She's learned that real love doesn't require you to ignore warning signs or excuse bad behavior, that the right person won't make you feel crazy for wanting transparency. The wedding dress was eventually donated to an organization that provides gowns for women who can't afford them. Emily couldn't stand to look at it, but she also couldn't stand the thought of it going to waste. Somewhere out there, another bride wore Emily's dress on her actual wedding day, and Emily hopes it brought her joy. The ring, the one David said belonged to his grandmother, turned out to be cubic zirconia bought at a mall kiosk. Even that was a lie. Emily had it melted down and turned into a small pendant she wears as a reminder. Not of David, not of the betrayal, but of her own strength, of the moment she stood up and walked away, of the life she rebuilt from nothing. If you were Emily, what would you have done in that moment at the altar? If someone you loved, someone you trusted completely, turned out to be a stranger, how would you move forward? Could you ever trust again? Could you forgive yourself for missing the signs? These aren't easy questions, and there are no right answers. But Emily would tell you this: the shame doesn't belong to the victim. It belongs to the person who chose to deceive. You're not naive for trusting someone. You're not stupid for believing in love. You're human. And being human means sometimes we get hurt by people who don't deserve our trust. But that doesn't mean we should stop trusting altogether. It means we learn. We grow. We become more careful without becoming cynical. We protect ourselves without closing ourselves off. And we remember that one person's betrayal doesn't define what we deserve. The church where it all happened still stands in Charleston. Emily drives past it sometimes on her way to work. At first, she'd take detours to avoid it, couldn't stand the sight of the building where her life fell apart. But eventually, she started seeing it differently. That church wasn't where her life ended. It was where it was saved. If Catherine hadn't walked through those doors, if the truth hadn't come out that day, Emily would be in a much worse situation now. She would have married David. He would have destroyed her financially. He probably would have disappeared when she was pregnant, leaving her alone with a child and massive debt. The public humiliation she experienced, as painful as it was, protected her from something far worse. So now when she drives past that church, she feels grateful. Grateful for Catherine's courage. Grateful for the truth, no matter how brutal. Grateful that she got the chance to start over. What do you think Emily should have done differently? Were there signs she should have caught earlier, or was David simply that good at deception? How would you feel if you discovered the person sleeping next to you was living under a fake identity? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I want to hear your perspective. And if this story made you think differently about trust, about love, about the importance of asking questions even when it feels uncomfortable, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for more real-life twists that will leave you speechless. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in the next one.